and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. Can we just pause a moment and consider the humanity of this? Just put ourselves in that position. This new generation of Israelites, they watched Aaron go up on this mountain. They watched his son go up with him. And then they saw Moses and Eleazar come back, and Aaron did not. And what did they do? Last part of verse 29. All the house of Israel wept for Aaron 30 days.
Please join us this week as Pastor Steve Brower continues our study in the book of Numbers. This week we'll focus on Numbers chapter 20. This passage is a transitional passage in the book of Numbers, which moves us from the first generation that left Egypt to the second generation that will have the opportunity to enter the Promised Land. This passage helps us make that transition from generation to generation by discussing the deaths of Aaron and Miriam as well as the failure of Moses.
Numbers chapter 20. This chapter, as we read it, it gives a recounting of the third travel narrative for Israel. So you think about the first travel narrative. This took the Israelites from Egypt to Sinai. And then the second travel narrative took the Israelites from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. And the third one takes them from Kadesh to the plains of Moab. So when you think about the book of Numbers and you think about the traveling that needs to occur, you remember that they need to spend 40 years in the wilderness, but the book does not talk about every place that it goes. It really is very concise as it takes a lot of these travel narratives and gives very short synopses of these. And so this is really what's happening here for us is the movement that we have on the map. Some of this is speculative, right? But you can see Kadesh Barnea, and this pointer is not super strong, but you can see it maybe if you look real close, squint a bit, and you might be able to see it. This is Kadesh Barnea up here. Kadesh Barnea, of course, is where the 12 spies went into the land and came back with 10 of them, of course, with a negative report. Then you have the wandering that happens in the wilderness. That's 40 years. 40 years that they are wandering in the wilderness as people are dying, waiting to die. And they go down, and you can see here, this whole area is Edom. I don't even see it on here either now, so I'm not sure. It might have just died. It is, oh, there it is. This whole area is Edom. And ultimately what's happening is they are moving up across Edom, and they're going to enter into the land of Canaan from the eastern side. And so the first generation was going to enter in from the south, but that is what did not happen. Now the second generation is going to enter from the east. And so chapter 20 discusses that final leg of their journey, that central section that talks about approaching Edom and wanting to go up the highway. That highway would have gone right through here, called the King's Highway. And Edom would not let them go up there. Of course, it's mountainous in that area, and so if you can't travel on the King's Highway, you have to go around. And so that's part of the topography that's there. Kadesh to the plains of Moab is what Numbers chapter 20 is all about. And the entire generation of the Israelites in between all of that needed to die in the wilderness. And that's what has happened actually before we get to chapter 20. Because if we think about Numbers chapter 20 verse 1, it says, the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. Okay, so think about this for a moment. It says they came in the first month. The first month of what? What we're talking about is we're talking about the new generation. This is the first month of the 40th year. We're seeing the death of Miriam, and she is a representative of the people of Israel. And so what we find here, this is one of the commentaries, Michael Morales, he has this image that he puts in his commentary, And you can kind of see that Edom passage is that central little flap. And so the first part of Numbers is the first generation. The second part of Numbers is the second generation of the Israelites. And that passage of Edom is the flap that connects the two. And so that's the idea of what's happening with this particular passage. Because with this passage, what it does is it discusses the death, of course, of Moses, of Aaron, and of Miriam. And these three represent the old generation, that first generation that left Egypt and that went up to the promised land. That first generation that rejected God's offer to enter into the promised land. And now there is a new generation. So in your minds, when you're reading Numbers chapter 20, we need to shift and think, we're talking now about a new generation. We're not talking about the same people. And what we learn is that the new generation needs new leaders. And that is maybe a singularly startling comment. We'll discuss why that's the case to a large degree. That usually is the case. We might even say that always is the case. There's always a question of when, but it always is the case. And so in order to discuss the death of Moses, which will actually come later, our author, who is, of course, Moses, right? Moses is the one who's writing Numbers, gives us a further example to illustrate his own failure. And he's doing it in a way to highlight the character of God. And so he's going to highlight the character of God, but he's going to do it by showing his own failure in the midst of it. It's tremendously humbling. But we shouldn't shy away from this, even as we try to see it from a correct perspective. None of us really want to pick on Moses. Amen? Does anybody here want to pick on Moses? We don't want to pick on Moses. And so we read this passage, and it's like we love Moses, our hearts go out to Moses, but you know who's picking on Moses? Moses is picking on Moses. Moses is writing this. Moses is saying, here is the truth of what happened. And it's God himself who is verifying these words that Moses is pointing out. And so I'm preaching this as somebody who doesn't want to pick on Moses. But yet that's the point of the passage. The point of the passage is Moses is doing a great job of saying, take your eyes off me, take your eyes off Aaron, take your eyes off Miriam, and put them on God. And that is a message that we all need to embrace. God himself must be our hope. So how does this passage highlight the truth that God himself must be our hope? And the first thing that it points out is that God never dies. Pretty somber, but a truth nonetheless. As I had already read, Numbers chapter 20, verse 1, the very last part of that, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Later on in Numbers chapter 20, it says, as they journeyed from Kadesh, the people of Israel, the whole congregation came to Mount Hor, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron at Mount Hor, on the border of the land of Edom, let Aaron be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land that I have given to the people of Israel, because you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. So we see Miriam dying in this passage. We see Aaron dying in this passage. And we see Moses' death foretold. Verse 28, Moses stripped Aaron of his garments. He put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. That's still Aaron. But verse 12 of chapter 20, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. And there the death of Moses is foretold. This is Numbers 27, so future. This is what it's forecasting, foreshadowing. The Lord said to Moses, go up into the mountain of Abraham and see the land that I've given to the people of Israel. When you have seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was. And he references this passage. Because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin when the congregation quarreled, failing to uphold me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. I'm certain you might have as you approach this passage and this thought, the same kind of questions that I had. What did Moses do that was so bad that he was prevented from seeing the land? And perhaps you've read the passage already and you struggle to see how it was so terrible. And we'll address some of those concerns in a moment, or at least attempt to address them. But my point here is a very simple, common sense point. All leaders except God die. And let's remember that such is the case. And it's good for us to recognize that whatever godly leaders God has put into our lives, they will one day pass away. And it is good for us to love them and appreciate them, to admire them, to follow them. But we also should recognize that they will die. I remember growing up at Grace Baptist Church in Owatonna, and the pastor that I remember the most was Ben Strobing. Is that a name that's familiar to anybody? Ben Strobing? Probably not. Oh, yeah, Bernie. Yep. Ben Strobing. And Ben Strobing I would look at as, yeah, right? You'd remember Ben Strobing. Ben Strobing, I would look at, he was the pastor of my youth, right? And so I had a lot of love and admiration for Ben Strobing. I remember my youth pastor. He was the youth pastor for my brother Dan. My brother Dan was 4 years older than me, and so I watched him go through youth group, and I watched his youth pastor pour into him, and that youth pastor was Chuck Phelps. And Chuck Phelps, many of you probably know Chuck Phelps, or at least you've heard that name. Chuck Phelps left the day that I entered into youth group. Coincidence? I don't know. I'm overstating it. I don't know that it was the day. But when I was entering the youth group, excited to have that youth pastor, Chuck Phelps says, I'm out of here. And I was brokenhearted and devastated, and I thought we'll never have as good a youth pastor as Chuck Phelps. And then along came Mark Young. And Mark Young was a great youth pastor, and God used him in a mighty way in my life. I remember going off to college, getting my degree, starting as a youth pastor in Watertown. I got a phone call from Don Kittle, who was pastor at Grace Baptist at that time, and Don asked me to come and to be an assistant pastor down there at Grace Baptist, my home church. And Don was a great mentor to me, and he poured into me. He was an older gentleman at that time and a tremendous pastor. He too now has passed away. He too has gone to his eternal home. It was Don who pointed out to me that you must be careful as a pastor not to place your hope in specific individuals within the church. And that is a tough thing. They too are human. They too will leave the scene one way or another. And if your hope is in them, then when they leave, your hope leaves. And it's a perpetual lesson, isn't it? I don't care what kind of leader you are or what position you are in. It is a perpetual lesson that if we put our hope in people in the sense of, and I don't mean having good thoughts for them or confidence in them or respect for them. I'm not talking about anything like that. If they are the source of our hope, it is a problem because that cannot be. And what it does when we see that loss that occurs is it ought to drive us back to the one who never leaves, the one in whom we should place our hope. And it's one thing to say, I'm going to hope in God, and I promise I'll always hope in God. It's another thing to say, He is the one to whom I always turn. It's another thing to say, He is the one that my heart is bent towards. It's another thing to say that when I think about my security, I'm thinking about God and not necessarily anybody else. And I would say that is a huge challenge that is there for all of us. And if we put ourselves into the position of the Israelites, you're talking about now a new generation that had understood and heard the stories about how Moses and Aaron and Miriam had led them up from Egypt, and they had seen their dads and their moms and their cousins die, and now they're a new generation, and the only leader that they knew was Moses and Aaron and Miriam. And it's like, what happens when they go away? What's going to happen to the nation of Israel? Man, that would have been a very real weight, wouldn't it have been? That would have been hard for them. But yet they needed to understand that their hope was not in Moses, as amazing as Moses was, and Moses was amazing. He really was. But it wasn't in him. It was in God. And we get a sense of that because after Moses, there was, of course, Joshua. And we know that, and we look at that and go, of course, that's the case. That's always the case. But it's one thing to know that that's the case. It's another thing to actually believe it in your own life because we get so attached from that standpoint. Even in Numbers chapter 20, this passage, verse 25, we see this transfer from Aaron to Eleazar. It says, take Aaron and Eleazar his son, bring them up to Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them on Eleazar his son. And Aaron shall be gathered to his people, and shall die there. Moses did as the Lord commanded. They went up Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation, and Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. Can we just pause a moment and consider the humanity of this? Just put ourselves in that position. This new generation of Israelites, they watched Aaron go up on this mountain. They watched his son go up with him. And then they saw Moses and Eleazar come back, and Aaron did not. And what did they do? Last part of verse 29. All the house of Israel wept for Aaron 30 days. And what a beautiful thing. The normal grieving process was 7 days, right? 7 days is not how long they would grieve. But here for Aaron, recognizing his impact in their life, they wept for 30 days. And so I would just cause us to pause and consider for a moment, in what people have you placed your hope? You say, Pastor Steve, are you trying to get me to not value people in my life? I'm not. I am trying to make sure that you are putting your hope in the right place. Are the people that you put your hope in a good source for that hope? Perhaps that's a father. Perhaps that's a mother. Perhaps that's a spouse. Perhaps that's a friend. Perhaps that's other leaders in your life. We need to appreciate them. We ought to value them. We should lean on them and respect them and love them, but we dare not place our hope in them. They are not the source of our hope. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, it says, keep your life free from love of money. Be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now we're inserting ourselves into Hebrews, and he's dealing here with this idea of putting your hope or your confidence, your contentment in something other than Christ, but it's the same point. So verse 6, so we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? And it's like, if that's where we can stand, if that's what we can stand upon, then we don't have to rely on anybody else, because we can rely upon the Lord. And what a tremendous thing for us to embrace. And certainly that's the message, one of the messages that's being portrayed in Numbers chapter 20. That their hope was God, and not Moses and Aaron and Miriam. God never dies, and God never fails. An old saying tells us those who don't remember the mistakes of the past are what? Doomed to repeat them, right? Along similar lines, some define an expert as someone who recognizes his mistakes when he makes them again. Think about that for a moment. It might be a little cynical, but I kind of like that definition. Many of us relate to this concept. We don't remember the mistakes of our past well enough to avoid them again, or we feel like we're trying to avoid them and you end up tripping over those same mistakes again. One person said, the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. You know, in that experience, we have a great deal in common with ancient Israel. They, too, consistently failed to learn from their experience. And we see that happening here in Numbers chapter 20. Because when we think about this passage, we're going to see a number of different things that sound very, very familiar. And so what I want us to do is to just walk through Numbers chapter 20, verse 2 through 13. This is the actual narrative that kind of details the time when Moses and Aaron rebelled against God. So look at verse number 2. It says, now there was no water for the congregation. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. Now, this might sound very familiar. You say, didn't they already have an episode of water at Meribah? You say, didn't that already occur? And I would say, you remember well. It did. But it occurred with the first generation. They had already gone through this. They had already come up from Egypt towards the Promised Land in the Exodus, and they had already had a Waters of Meribah incident. What's crazy is that this new generation now has a very similar incident. You say, maybe it's the same thing, and I would tell you it's not. There are too many differences, and we'll see that as we work our way through it. But it sounds very familiar. Verse 3, the people quarreled with Moses and said, would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. When did the brothers perish? We're talking about the 40 years in the wilderness. We're talking about that generation that died. That's what they're talking about. And so they're saying, we wish we would have died with them. We wish we would have perished because now we're here and we're going to die anyway. You said, didn't their fathers and mothers say the same thing 40 years ago-ish? Yeah, they did. Verse 4, why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates. There is no water to drink. Now, if you're Moses and you hear them make this statement, why have you brought the assembly into the wilderness? Why have you made us come up out of Egypt? Would you not in your mind think, I didn't make that choice? What did Moses do? He brought them to the Promised Land. He brought them to Kadesh Barnea. Who decided that they didn't want to go into the land? Well, it wasn't Moses. And so you can imagine Moses' response in his own mind, and we're putting ourselves there, would be, I didn't make that choice. Your parents made that choice. They chose this. The only reason we're not in the Promised Land now is because you folks decided you didn't want to be there because you didn't trust God. And you can almost hear that coming out of him as they accuse him of this. This wasn't Moses' problem. What did Moses do? Did he deserve the blame? Moses was willing to continue to lead them, even through the wilderness. Moses might have had in his own mind, tell you what, you people do your own thing, I'm going to the Promised Land. But he didn't. He stuck with them because God had asked him to, and now he's getting blamed for it. Is it sometimes hard being a leader? Yep. Do you sometimes get blamed for things that you shouldn't get blamed for? Yep. Does that mean that they're wrong to do it? Yep. Does that change anything? Nope. It's just how it is. And so this is where Moses is. He's dealing with this. And notice what they say. Verse 5, why you've made us come out of Egypt to bring us to an evil place. It's no place for grain or figs. Do you notice anything missing? He isn't talking about the leeks. Where are the leeks? They aren't talking about, do you remember the great food and the great environment that we had back in Egypt? Why? Well, because they don't remember it, because they were never back in Egypt. This is the new generation. So what are they doing? They're looking forward, and they're saying, man, we wish things were here that would have been there, that are there in the Promised Land. But they aren't looking back to Egypt that way. And so we see the difference that is there. Verse 6, then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Now, I think I'm right that this is the last time that the glory of the Lord appears to Moses and Aaron in the book of Numbers. That things shift at this point. In the old generation, that first generation, that was how God spoke to Moses and Aaron. Now things are shifting into that new generation. And I think there's a lot of great truth that is captured in those simple concepts, because a lot of times we want God to do the same thing that he has always done. But God regularly changes how he interacts with us as humans. And so he does not interact with us the way that he did with Adam and Eve, and the way that he did with Abraham, and the way that he did in the Old Testament, and the way even that he did in the early New Testament. He does not act with us in the same way. And you say, why doesn't God just stay consistent and act with us in one way? And I would say God is consistent, but he's consistent in how he cares for us. It's his character that's consistent. His interaction does change. And that simply is God's pattern. And so we see that happening here. where we see the glory of the Lord appearing to them. They respond to him the same way. The glory of the Lord appears, and we would expect God to be upset, because that's what would have happened in the first generation. And then Moses and Aaron would plead for God to show compassion. But that isn't what happens. Verse 7, back to 7. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before your eyes to yield its water." There is no condemnation of the new generation. There is just direction to give them water from the rock. And that's different than what we have typically seen God's response to be as he is interacting with that first generation. It's a shift. Notice it says, "Take the staff," and maybe in your mind you're thinking, what staff? Notice verse 9, Moses took the staff from before the Lord. That's the textual clue that tells us what staff we're talking about. Do you remember Aaron's staff? The staff that budded? The staff that they kept in the Ark of the Covenant before the Lord? He's talking about that staff. He says, take that staff from the Ark of the Covenant and use that staff to ultimately draw water from the rock. God was determining to use Aaron's staff as a symbol, a demonstration of his kindness and love. That staff was a symbol of life out of death. And we had worked through that passage to see it. Verse number 8, as it says up there, "Take the staff, assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its waters." What is Moses to do? Tell the rock to give up its waters. Verse 10, "Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, 'Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?'" Now we look at this and say, well, it's not that much different than what God had told him, but the differences are pretty crucial. Let me ask you this. Is this the tone of God that you and I just heard back in these verses? Is there a difference in tone? God said, "Take the staff, assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, give drink to the congregation and their cattle." Well, that's a tone. "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" Well, that's a tone. Those are two different tones. Have you ever had that opportunity to tell someone, "I do not like your attitude"? How do you know what somebody's attitude is? You can't see their attitude. And it's like you cannot help but see their attitude. Their attitude is very clear. What is Moses' attitude here? Let me put it this way. Moses' attitude does not match God's attitude. And that's the problem. Because Moses is a representative of God. Now, you and I are clued in to God's attitude because Moses is recording for us what God had said. But did the children of Israel at that time know what God had said? The only way they knew what God had said is how Moses portrayed it. And so Moses stood up, and Moses was ticked. And what does that mean for them? God's ticked. Because that's all they would have known. And so Moses is communicating God's attitude and things about him that simply are not true. And therein lies the problem. Because Moses was intended to be God's representative for the people of Israel. That they would look at him and they would see God. And this is the problem. They have to trust Moses. Moses represents God. And how does Moses represent God here? Angry, frustrated, grudgingly giving them water. And that is not the tone that God wants them to see. Verse 11, Moses lifted up his hand. This probably would catch your attention if you were seeing it in Hebrew. This is the same language as when we looked at the passage that talked about sinning with a high hand, a high-handed sin. It's the raised hand. And so Moses raises his hand. He lifts up his hand and he strikes the rock with his staff twice. Is this Aaron's staff? Is it his staff? It says his staff. Presumably, Aaron is holding up his staff, Aaron is using his staff to strike the rock. We don't know for certain what that would have looked like, of course. And then verse 12. We should first see the end of verse 11. Moses lifted up his hand, struck the rock with the staff twice. Water came out abundantly. The congregation drank and their livestock. God continued to pour out his grace even in the midst of Moses' disobedience. And verse 12, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. And so from this verse, we take our cues as to how we should view this entire episode. Moses did not believe God enough to hold him up as holy in the eyes of the people. Now, what exactly is meant there? I mean, Moses' faith had waned. Moses struggled with this. Now, we could wonder how Moses responded inwardly when God explained his plan of abundant provision of waters for his people. It was clear that God had divine compassion for this complaining people. But rather than confirming what Yahweh said and conforming to his character, rather than submitting his own heart to the divine will, Moses stumbled upon the compassion of God. Moses was angry with the Israelites, and God was not. And Moses found that to be unjust. Who does that sound like? Jonah? Where God's compassion, he felt, was unwarranted. Now, we could make all kinds of excuses for this, and we want to, and so we can, right? Because we could remember that Moses had been dealing with this first generation of Israelites and had become exasperated by their unbelief, their depravity, their restless complaints, their vicious accusations, their rebellions. Moses would have grown weary under the slow passage of their judgment that they had to die in the wilderness. 38 heavily darkened years. And we get a small snippet of it, right? And so we put ourselves into Moses' position, and the weight of that would have been overwhelming. And all of that then comes bubbling forth when this new generation comes up, and you realize they're just like the old one. And Moses gets angry. And he says, I'm going to deal with you harshly. And God says, I'm going to deal with them compassionately. And it's like, dear friends, this is the beauty of our God. You know, as this old life wears down on every one of us, and we see the injustices, we see the sin, we see the corruption, we see the death, we see the destruction, do you not grow tired of it? Does it not weigh on you? And at some point, you begin to say, nothing will ever change. And that new generation, you treat as if they were the old generation. Because after all, they will one day be that way. I know they will be. But yet, God doesn't do that. Isn't that amazing? That his love is so vast that he says that old generation had a Waters of Meribah incident, and the new generation need a Waters of Meribah incident. You know, it's amazing to see how God is willing to pour into that new generation again and again and again and again. And sometimes you look at that as an older generation and you say, hey, I've got all of these things that God has done in my life, and it's like, will he do those same things in other people's lives? And I would say a passage like Numbers chapter 20 tells us that yes, he will. And you may have become jaded and you may have become disillusioned, and I would simply call you, dear believer, if you feel that weight, then you need to renew your heart, not upon your own experience, but upon the character of your God. Because he is worth trusting. And you say, but my experience tells me nothing will ever change. And I would say, cast your experience aside and trust in the character of your God. be willing to approach it all anew just like him. You say, we're picking on Moses so much, and I'm saying we're learning so much from Moses because Moses is us. We're Moses. Because this is what happens to us. This is why I said at the beginning that it is always good for a new generation to invest in a new generation. I mean leaders. Because that weariness will occur. I remember as a young pastor talking with my mentor Don Kittle, an older pastor, and seeing the weariness of the ministry on him, and I say, bless God, by his grace, that won't happen to me. And here I am. And we can laugh about it, and we can, but there's some truth to it. And it's like, what do you stand on? It's like you have to run back to God. Because he is the one who doesn't fail. God himself had originally orchestrated his intended provision of abundant waters in the wilderness to display his glory before this new sons of Israel, right? Before their eyes. Verse 8. Moses and Aaron not only missed the opportunity to demonstrate God's ability, kind of building and fostering that second generation's trust in him, but they misrepresented his character and his will. It's a grievous thing. It is really actually quite problematic. Because God said, I want you to show my character to them, and they said, no, we're going to let this whole different view impact them. And God said, you must pass from the scene. There needs to be new leaders. And he raised up Joshua, and he raised up Eleazar to take that spot. So rather than fostering a proper perception of God, Moses rebelled against divine compassion, and he misrepresented him in an absolute manner. It's devastating. Now, in essence, when we think about this whole nature, most of our sins boil down to a functional failure to believe God. And that's what's happening for our dear friend Moses. In theory, we believe that God is our rock and our refuge. In practice, however, we often act as if God doesn't even exist. Why do people judge people and write them off as hopeless? It's because in practice, we don't really believe that God can rescue and redeem them. Why do we get so angry and frustrated when our spouses and our families and our churches and our friends disappoint us? It's because we don't really believe that God is their judge. And we aren't willing to let their sanctification rest in his hands. And we say, I shall be the one who will determine whether something is right or wrong. And that, of course, is failing to believe God. It's because we don't believe he has our best interests at heart, or that there's more to life than what we see around us in this world. And we're condemned by our failure to believe in the Lord as rebels against his goodness. Just like Moses and Aaron and an entire generation of the ancient Israelites, we push back against the goodness of God. Because of our own sin, we find ourselves in a position we never thought we'd be in, where we're the ones fighting and saying, no, don't be compassionate. And it's like, how did that happen? It's like our own sin has deceived us, our failure to believe God. We have been corrupted by our own sin nature. Moses, Aaron, Miriam, they were incredible leaders. And we would be blessed to have been able to follow their lead. We ought to be thankful for our leaders, to respect them, to respect the fact that God has put them into their positions, to obey them as they follow God, but also anticipate that they will fail. They will pass off the scene. And our hope is still secure in the one who never dies and in the one who never fails. Let me encourage you to just examine in your own heart and ask yourself that question: in whom is my hope?